The EF4 tornado that hit western Kentucky on December 10, 2021 was record-breaking. Complete devastation was left in the wake of the 167-mile path that started in Tennessee and ended in Breckenridge, Kentucky. Over 50 people died and over 500 were injured. Property damage was extensive. There was also a smaller tornado that tracked in southern Kentucky the same night. 4 months after this major weather event, Kentuckians are still early in the recovery efforts. Here to talk about the recovery efforts is Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. Well, thanks for joining us. Governor Beshear, this was such a large-scale disaster within your state, and the mobilization efforts had to have been huge. Can you give us an idea of the timeline and what was required for you to respond immediately to this?
Well, this is the single largest, most devastating, deadly tornado disaster, certainly in the history of Kentucky, if not in the history of the United States. It's hard to imagine an F4 tornado, the destructive force of which is almost incomprehensible, being on the ground in Kentucky for over 200 miles. Hitting cities and towns like Mayfield and Dawson Springs and Bremen so violently that there's not a government building standing in Mayfield. 70% of homes in Dawson Springs were wiped out. Bremen is a small town, and the number of lives lost there compared to the total population is just heartbreaking. We had issues that night to the next morning of a candle factory collapsing, thinking there might be up to 100 people still left in it. I was there at first light, and think about 10 backhoes or heavy equipment trying to pull cars off of what used to be the roof, which is now 4 feet off the ground. Having a hard time even getting to a place where you could look for survivors in Dawson Springs because all the power lines are blocking so much of the town. But when you see disaster and difficulty, you also see heroism and altruism, generosity and courage. You know, I was there at first light, so were first responders from all over Kentucky and our sister states. Watching in that candle factory, already having Louisville and Lexington's emergency response teams there with their equipment, watching the National Guard helping with search and rescue in Dawson and in other areas. But maybe just as important, watching people who had gotten in their trucks drive up to homes that had been destroyed, introduce themselves for the very first time and say, you know, what do you need? We saw all types of groups from FEMA, which was on the ground very early, helping our National Guard, our state police. We had our transportation cabinet, which did an incredible job out in huge numbers clearing roads, and then ultimately debris. Divisions of forestry, both federal and state, out trying to just clear enough road to get to people who needed us. Red Cross, United Way, on the ground as quickly as possible. A local church from Murray was up within half a day. Food organizations coming from all over the United States setting up, people bringing laundry trucks, which I didn't know existed, in almost immediately. Churches opening their doors. We opened our state parks immediately.
Yes.
And had our rangers bringing people that night in the midst of it, saying, we got you, getting them in a room. Our staff came in the middle of the night and were making hot meals. Really incredible to see the outpouring of help at that point, and fast forward a couple of days and just the outpouring of love from all over the country and the world.
Most definitely. It was an unbelievable response, especially from the region, even up here in Evansville, Indiana. Now, we've known that a lot of people donated a lot of money. There was a lot of assistance coming in right for that immediate help. But we also know that recovery is a very long-term process. And, that can be a frustrating process as well. So tell us about some of the assistance programs and how people can still plug into the help that they need.
So you're exactly right. There's a lot of groups that come in with dollars right on the front end. And first, there's the emergency needs. Let's give people shelter. Let's get them meals. Let's try to help them get those critical documents that we all have to function. Let's help them figure out where they're going to live for the next 2 weeks. And the Red Cross, the United Way, and so many other groups that are on the ground right there from the region are very good at that piece. But then, you move a little bit later. This is an event that's going to take 2 years, maybe a little bit more to fully recover and to be fully rebuilt on. But let me tell you, the last time anything close to this happened was in West Liberty, Kentucky. And that, we just hit the 10th anniversary. And talk about a light that shows you there is a better tomorrow. That's been pretty special to see. So even in our darkest hours, we do know things are going to get better. But there are still a lot of programs out there. Most of them still require people to have gone through the FEMA process, even if they haven't recovered as much as they would have hoped. What that does is it ensures that we are providing the resources to those who need it. Because unfortunately, any time where there's human misery or difficulty, there are those that try to prey on us. That can be from looting to taking advantage of these programs. Certainly the Team Western Kentucky Tornado Relief Fund has already put out over $10 million to families. That's everything from first grieving together and providing money for funeral expenses so people don't have to worry about that in the immediate aftermath, to helping first uninsured renters and homeowners, those that don't have an extra process to go through, and now helping out those that are insured with their deductibles, and now looking at how we don't just do the emergency needs. So we move from the emergency really to the intermediate. And in the intermediate, we try to say, how do we get you out of a hotel and into a travel trailer or into a rental unit that already exists? How do we get kids close to their school system in there so the bus can pick them up and so we can provide wraparound services? How do we get people close enough to their work so they're not driving an hour and then having additional childcare problems? How do we keep our seniors close to their churches and their communities? So, we've gone from having 800 plus people in our state parks to now having about 73. With a lot more people in travel trailers in a couple of different areas, but then also finding that intermediate where someone can stay not for 2 weeks, but for 6 months. But the big piece we're on now, where the funding really comes in, is how do we rebuild and not have that be done on the backs of those that have suffered. So we're in negotiations right now with some of the larger nonprofits that do this work, saying how do we bring the rest of our fund and other funds in here so that we can rebuild faster, so that we can ensure that when people go back into a rebuilt home, they're not in debt when they might still be looking for a job that got destroyed, facility while they were there. And we think we're close. Thankfully, people have been so generous that we hope we can leverage a little bit of the existing dollars that we have to make sure that we don't get a proposal that says we'll build X over 4 years. We get it more in the immediate. And I want people to remember, we have a lot of programs without these funds that exist to help you out. That's everything from disaster SNAP benefits and the regular, that's the food benefits that are out there, to some housing and rental assistance, even some COVID dollars that are left to help people out there. We have a website at the governor's page that can provide people all different types of resources on where you go to get help for different things. And we want, as much as we can, to get you in a program that we can keep you in for a couple of months. Those are programs that exist, as opposed to just a one-time bit of assistance.
Well, such a long road ahead, but there is a lot of support and a lot of hope. So thank you so much, Governor Andy Beshear, for joining us.
Thank you, and we'll make it.
Our producer, Jacob Berkla, visited Dawson Springs and spoke with some people on the ground helping with relief efforts.
Hopkins County right now, as far as like citizen relief, we've stood up a long-term recovery corporation, long-term recovery group, and they actually bring in a lot of resources. They've got caseworkers. There's many charitable organizations that are partnered with them. Plus, they have access to some funds and able to help get people that were impacted by the tornadoes. They're able to get them help, with fixing their property, help with getting it cleaned up, and moving forward and building the next piece of their life. I know without the volunteer efforts, we would not be where we are today. I mean, there's been tremendous progress made in Hopkins County, in the Dawson area, the Isley area, in the Barnsley areas, because of the dedication and the efforts of our volunteer force. There's been groups locally, there's been groups from all over the country. There's even been some groups from out of country that have come in and volunteered their efforts through personnel, through equipment, and through donations and monetary resources. It's been an awesome thing. The biggest key is that a lot of these bigger organized groups that volunteer, church groups and stuff like that, typically they bring large numbers, and you can assign them a project and then they go and oversee that project, assign them an area to work, and they'll oversee that and get that done for you. Our biggest push is trying to get the debris cleaned up, getting it hauled off, so that way people have the ability to start rebuilding. It's a big thing is that if you still got a bunch of debris, it's hard to start building in working around debris. We're still actively partnered with the state, with FEMA. We try to help channel people in those directions to where they can get that assistance.
So far, we've received over 15,000 applications here in the state of Kentucky. For those that were, 12,000 of those were eligible for either household housing assistance program or in the other needs assistance program. More than $15 million have already been approved, and those dollars are in survivors' hands either for temporary repairs, temporary housing, rental assistance, also for other needs assistance such as appliances that were destroyed or vehicles, medical storage, those that were part of this event. Here, the important thing is that we want people to understand is that FEMA has not left the state of Kentucky, that we're here to still assist survivors. Even though the disaster deadline has concluded, FEMA is still here to assist those, either by calling the 1-800-621-3362 number for those that still need to compile information. But the important thing is to continue keeping in touch with FEMA. That is one of our very most important messages, and speaking with representative with your case specifics, whatever documentation is needed, whatever information is needed. Because FEMA is not here doesn't mean that your case is closed. You still can appeal your case. If you receive a letter, you have 60 days from the time you receive your letter to make that appeal. Always have proper documentation in reference of what your appeal is about.
Now we're joined by Heath Duncan. He is the Executive Director of Pennyrile Habitat for Humanity and also co-chairs the Long-Term Recovery Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Heath.
Glad to be here.
So tell us about your long-term recovery group focuses on a specific county, and can you give us an estimate of how many dwellings were affected by the tornado and kind of how you come to that statistic? I know it's a little complicated.
It is a little complicated, and we have that data in a couple different sets, and one is Red Cross data, the other is FEMA data. We think that the Red Cross data may be more accurate. It suggests that a little more than 400 homes were completely destroyed just in Hopkins County. The FEMA data shows some lower numbers, but it only takes into account the families that applied at FEMA. And so we're really looking more toward the Red Cross data to kind of give us a better idea of that. And then, of course, our local government is also counting and comparing to our PVA stats. So we think we have about 400 completely destroyed and another 150 with major damage.
So what would prevent a family from applying for FEMA assistance, in terms of getting that help and rebuilding?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is just lack of understanding, maybe even lack of trust in FEMA. It's not an easy process because you go to FEMA and then most of the time they're going to deny you right away and refer you to the SBA, which is the Small Business Administration. And then if you don't qualify for a loan, then you go back to FEMA and you may get FEMA assistance at that point. But they do that so that they encourage you to take out the Small Business Administration loan, even though it's the SBA. It is for home ownership as well. As some of us probably were familiar with when the PPP loans came out during COVID, the SBA is actually who administered that money. And so I think for some folks, they're intimidated by the process, and so they just choose not to. Or maybe there's mistrust, but
Yeah.
those are some of the reasons.
Sounds like it can be a little frustrating as well, being denied and then having to go through more hoops. So your group helps focus on the long-term recovery. What are some of the efforts where you swoop in and help to assist these families?
Well, long-term recovery is what it sounds like. It is really we come along sort of in between early recovery and then the beginning of long-term recovery, and so. The group was created out of a town hall meeting where I was nominated to be a co-chair of the group. And so, from there, we really start to look at long-term and establish what those long-term goals are. I know Dawson Springs and the Barnsley area just outside of Dawson Springs is where most of the damage was in Hopkins County. And, in Dawson Springs, it wiped out 2/3 of the town. And so, the destruction is complete, but they also have an opportunity maybe to rethink themselves and kind of rethink the city. It was a very old city. And so, that's kind of the silver lining of all of this is maybe we have a way forward to, rethink how the city's laid out and, what maybe makes sense in a more modern era. And so we'll start reaching out to families through that FEMA data and Red Cross data to try to discover what their needs are. We call that case management in long-term recovery. And we'll work with each of those families individually with organizations like Catholic Charities and community volunteers to work that out.
So what type of temporary housing solutions have been put in place? Are they housed temporarily in Dawson Springs? Are they outside of that area? And then how do you move from that temporary housing solution to the more permanent?
So right after the tornado, during the early recovery process, the Pennyroyal State Park took in a lot of families. Some of the families were put in hotels, and so they were scattered around in different places. I'm the director of a Habitat affiliate and realized that there's an affordable housing crisis really in America, but definitely in the state of Kentucky. And so the housing stock for rental wasn't a plethora of those, and so we didn't have a lot of houses for families to go into that were vacant. So they were spread around state parks, hotels, different places. We're trying to figure out now, how do we get them into intermediate housing before we get to long term, and that's where some of the FEMA trailers and the trailers from the state come into play. They're really designed as an intermediate solution for some of those families. But as we know, living in a camper is not the ideal situation. But we're starting to look at some of the long-term strategies, and that's where organizations like Habitat for Humanity and others will come into play as we just start discovering what those families' needs are and abilities.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in terms of rebuilding with the inflation, with supply chain issues, those types of things. How do you envision people being able to rebuild economically in terms of what they've had in today's environment?
That is a real challenge, and that existed even before the tornado. The supply chain and inflation are major issues for us, but I think there will be ways to overcome that. I mean, it has amazed me at how much support we've received from all over the world, really. But even from the state, I mean, there are a few pots of money out there that are going to help us get folks back into houses in an affordable way. And a lot of them either had no insurance or are underinsured. But I think there will be some methods and mechanisms we can use to overcome that. The supply chain issue is what's really going to slow us down. That and weather. A lot of people are surprised that we're not rebuilding, more than we are. Of course, I come from the construction world, and we don't start a lot of houses in the middle of the winter for a reason, and it's hard to do. But I think as we gain momentum going forward, we'll be able to start, really building back quickly. But those are definitely concerns, and we're exploring, ways to get around that now.
You mentioned the assistance coming in from everywhere else. So what can local people do to help in the assistance as it comes to long-term recovery?
I think, one of the things that I have come to realize in a disaster is that if you are interested in helping and donating in some way, reach out first before you do that, because we need to be a little more strategic about what the donations are. Donations aren't always free. I can tell you that we have a large amount of plywood that's been donated, but we don't have a place to put it yet. Now we're working on that. We need a shelter to keep it dry and safe and that sort of stuff. And that sort of material is coming to us faster than what we can handle it, and so we're having to actually spend money just to handle that material. And so, reach out to your long-term recovery group in whatever county you're interested in, and we can help think through how we can place those donations so that they don't go to waste and that they're used well.
Very quickly, if someone needs some help, how do they reach out to you?
They can reach out through our Facebook page, Hopkins County Long-Term Recovery Group, and they can also reach out to Penny Ryle Habitat. I am the co-chair. We will also house the admin and the construction position for Long-Term Recovery Group, so we can be that point of contact.
All right. Thank you so much, Heath. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Joining us now is Cody Dodds, Lead Benefits Staff Attorney for Kentucky Legal Aid, to go over some of the legal issues survivors might run into. Cody, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
So tell us, what are some of the needs that people have or are inquiring about whenever they make a call to your service?
Absolutely. It's important to recognize that recovery from a natural disaster can be a long process, and the legal needs that we see our clients face evolve over time, depending on where we're at in that recovery process. Kentucky Legal Aid responded immediately after the disaster, going to disaster recovery sites with FEMA to help replace lost documents like birth certificates, driver's licenses, social security cards, in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. And of course, that's evolved over time to helping folks apply and appeal FEMA financial assistance and housing assistance. And now, kind of in the 4 to 5 month window after the tornadoes, we're now seeing a lot of housing issues. Of course, finding replacement housing, working with landlords to ensure that damages are being repaired, or if repairs aren't possible, we're ensuring that tenants receive financial assistance to find new and suitable housing, and same, of course, for homeowners, working with their insurance companies in those policy disputes, and hopefully avoiding any contractor scams that may be going on in our communities.
Wow, I mean, there's just so much involved. And of course, we always think of the immediate needs. Everyone swoops in to take care of those immediate needs, but you mentioned what a long process this is. About how long does it take for the average family or average disaster victim to get through this process and really get all of these things worked out?
Sure. I think depending on the particular circumstances, I think planning ahead for at least maybe a year after the natural disaster would be prudent. The FEMA appeals process can be quite lengthy, especially if a person has insurance that has to be worked out as part of that process. And so that's why it's so important to speak with an attorney or the local long-term recovery centers in our communities to ensure that we're on top of those timelines, making sure documents are getting submitted so that they can be resolved as quickly as possible.
Of course, they're vulnerable anyway, and they've already gone through so much. They also are probably vulnerable to scams and things like that. Are you seeing anything in terms of people taking advantage of disaster victims and how they can protect themselves, either legally or otherwise, to make sure that they are not taken advantage of at such a vulnerable time?
Absolutely. I'm pleased to report that at least I have not seen that coming through our system yet. And I hope that's because we saw our communities respond so quickly and appropriately to get people help. But just some tips to look out for as you're negotiating with contractors and insurance companies and others. We really encourage folks to think local whenever you're thinking about contractors, think about the companies that you already know and trust in your communities. And don't be afraid to check for references. If your family or friends have used the contractor before, then that's something to look out for. Of course, the golden rule is if it's too good to be true, then it probably is. As a disaster survivor, you have a right to see licenses and insurance policies from these contractors. And so for me, it'd be a red flag if anyone refused to give that information to review. And of course, there may be contracts that need to be signed to get these services, to get repairs underway. If you're faced with a limited time to sign that contract, I would be a little bit skeptical too. Take your time to read the contract, make sure you understand what you're signing and agreeing to, and of course, talk to an attorney if there's anything you don't understand.
Very sound advice. Of course, what legislation is already in place in terms of protecting and helping survivors of natural disasters?
Sure. The main source of relief here is through the federal government, the FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And so that provides for the most relief that we see. However, we're very fortunate that Governor Beshear, of course, began the Team Western Kentucky Fund, and those funds, I believe, are being distributed or will soon be distributed to impacted families. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, through February, folks were eligible for disaster food stamps, disaster SNAP benefits, and those had expanded eligibility categories, as well as disaster unemployment assistance for folks who couldn't return to their work because of damage incurred by the tornado. Those programs have expired at this point, unfortunately. However, if folks feel that they were wrongfully denied, then they may have the right to appeal those decisions.
So after a disaster, who would legally qualify for assistance in Kentucky for your legal aid in Kentucky?
Yeah. So right now we have a disaster legal services hotline that is specifically for victims and survivors of the tornado. And so that is a special and separate intake process than the kind of more usual legal services that we provide. What I would encourage folks to do is, call, apply for our services, and let us help determine if folks are eligible, because we'll do everything that we can to ensure that we're serving as many folks as possible. But we do occasionally have to screen for income and kind of assets, but in general, we will do our best to qualify. And it'll help us through that intake process to have some of that information available, like pay stubs or social security numbers, birthdays of folks in the household.
Okay, so briefly, what can we do before a natural disaster to prepare, knowing that this is such a lengthy process? Or there are documents or things that we can do to make sure that we're ready in this type of event?
Yeah, we encourage everyone, regardless of age, to have important estate planning documents in place, especially if we have children or grandchildren. So those can include a power of attorney to ensure that if something happened to us, then we have a trusted family member or friend who can make decisions for us or for our children. A living will, which again helps folks make medical decisions for us if we can't make those decisions. And then a last will and testament. Of course, these aren't necessarily fun documents to talk about. Having those in place can relieve the burden on our families and our other loved ones in the event of emergency. Of course, having these documents isn't always the end of it, especially in a natural disaster. So we encourage folks to keep copies of these documents and other important documents like insurance policies and that sort of thing backed up either in like a safety deposit box or scanned and uploaded into a cloud service like Google, Dropbox, iCloud. That way they're accessible no matter where you are, as long as you have access. And then, of course, keeping insurance up to date and ensuring the contents of your home, not just necessarily the structures on your home.
Great advice. Well, Cody Dodds with Kentucky Legal Aid, we appreciate all your great information and your time. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you all.
Thanks to all of our guests for joining us to let us know how the tornado recovery in Kentucky is going. Next week, we'll be taking a look at local recycling efforts. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.